Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Continuing on with verses 42 and 43 of Baqarah. And this is continuing the same passage which is addressed specifically to Bani Israel, the children of Israel, also known as the Jewish people. Um, and what began in verse 40 was a sort of list of commands, injunctions to the Jewish people, which, as I've said, really apply to all of us. So just to review in English, the list of commands was um, remember my blessing upon you and fulfill my covenant, basically keep your promises to me, and fear me alone. So that's verse 40 in a nutshell, basically three requirements to remember, basically be grateful, remember, keep your promise to me, and fear me alone. And then in verse 41, and believe in what I've sent down, which is not, basically the Qur'an, which is, yes, a new message, but it also is confirming what is already with you. If that's the Jews that we're talking about, it's the Torah revealed to Moses. But for all of us too, we all have some previous glimpses at the truth. Um, and then in verse 42, the requirements are going to be added to. So that's where we're going to pick up where we left off. Oh no, I think I skipped one. So believe in what I sent on confirming what is with you, and also the others are kind of negative commands. Do not do this. Do not be a kafir. Do not be the first kafir. Do not exchange my signs for a small price. But also there's a positive command at the very end of verse 41, which is me alone defend from. So 40 ends with me alone fear. 41 ends with me alone protect yourself from, meaning save yourself from my punishment. And don't worry about any other punishment. Okay, so now we begin with 42. Walla talbisu al-haq bil batil wa taqtamu al-haq wa antum talamun. And do not mix al-haq, the truth, with al-batil, falsehood, and conceal the truth while you know. Wa'aqimu al-swalat wa'atu al-zakat warka'u ma'a al-raki'in. And stand by communication and give zakat, basically give in order to purify yourself, and bow down with those who bow down. And that's it. So those are two short ayat, but there's a lot of key words, especially in that second ayah, number 42. So starting with 41, I'm sorry, it's verses 42 and 43. So starting with verse 42, do not mix truth with falsehood, and conceal the truth while you know. So again, as with the preceding ayat, we can take these as applying specifically to the Jewish people, but at the same time, I think they apply to all people. So we can talk about those both in turn. First, as applies to the Jewish people in particular, um, it would seem that what God is saying here is don't mix the truth of this new message the truth of the previous message that you received through Moses and subsequent prophets, basically the Torah. Don't mix that with whatever you have, your people, the Jewish people, have added to the Torah, right? Um, and I mean, in fact, that's partly why the Quran is being sent down, right? To purify the message, to get rid of any impurities that were introduced into the message as conveyed through Moses and others, or by Moses and others. Um, get rid of all of the inventions, all of the sectarianism that was introduced, because, of course, there were different sects of Judaism at this time. Um, don't mix, don't confuse. Talbisu kind of means both mix, confuse, and confuse, obscure. Don't mix the truth with things of your own making, which are inevitably falsehood. I mean, this is one of the main points of the Quran, is that if it's of your own making, it must therefore be false, no matter how well intentioned. Just what God says, that's all that is the truth. Everything else is going to confuse and spoil and corrupt the truth. And this is what sets the Quran apart from all other teachings, is that with every other teaching, the teacher, him or herself, is always introducing his or her own ideas and the ideas and practices of his or her own culture. Um, Whereas what the Quran is telling us to do, and of course, I don't think this is usually done, perhaps it's almost never done, but what the Quran is telling us to do is, when you teach the Quran, only present the Quran. Do not present any of your own ideas, any of your own inventions. And of course, that's difficult, because as soon as you open your mouth, even if you're only translating from as best you can from Arabic to English, your ideas come into play, right? But you're trying as hard as you can, ideally, to keep yourself out of it, keep your own ideas out of it, and just be a medium for God's word. And that seems so simple and obvious and sensible, because if you really believe this is God's word, wouldn't that be sufficient? Wouldn't that be the ideal? Would be just keep yourself out of it. I'm just the middleman. And yet, not only is it not like accomplished, that would be one thing, because we know it's difficult to keep oneself out of whatever it is we are communicating. Not only is it difficult to accomplish, but it's not even really attempted most of the time. I mean, openly, as far as I understand it, I'm not someone who has really read a lot or watched a lot of videos of Quran scholarship. So I admit to not being knowledgeable in that area. But as far as I can tell, Quran teachers, whatever you call them, um, openly present their own ideas and interpretations. And there are exceptions to this. I think Ishraq Ahmed was an exception. Obviously, I believe my father-in-law, Mustafa Wahid Zaman, is an exception. Um, and I'm sure there are other exceptions as well. But there seems to be this strange um, embracing of what the Quran is forbidding, which is to put yourself into your own teaching of the Quran, put your own ideas and interpret it. I mean, interpretation is a strange word, because, of course, there's interpretation like where you have an Arabic word. We'll deal with a couple of them in a moment, inshallah. Zakat, swalat. And I have no choice but to interpret those words. That's what translation is. It's an interpretation. But that's not the same thing as interpretation in the sense of, I'm going to tell you what this verse means. It doesn't mean merely what it says, it means this other thing. For instance, Hakim salat. That's in the next verse, verse 43. What that literally means, roughly, is stand, and there's no real preposition. As often in Arabic, prepositions are kind of left out, are left implied. But stand, communication. So I have to interpret, I have to fill in the blanks a little bit using whatever I know of Arabic, um, and obviously informed by other translations. But literally, stand in, in communication, and we assume communication with God, stand on your communications with God in a metaphorical sense of sort of building a foundation upon that that base of communicating with God, right? But the standard translation is a more openly biased interpretation because the standard translation is establish prayer, and usually the word regular is added. Establish regular prayer. And that's not at all what it says. It's just not. Swalat doesn't literally mean prayer, however much you want to say God, that's what God means by it. That's not what Swalat, the word, means. It means communication or contact. And Akimu does not mean establish, even if standing and establishing are somewhat related, right? Because if a building is standing, it's established in that at that site. But still, stand and establish are not the same thing. And when you put those two words together, neither of which are the literal meaning of Akimu Swalat, you have an interpretation, which means practice this thing, which we call one of the five pillars of Islam, the five canonical prayers. And every day say these five prayers. And so you see how already you've taken two words from the Quran, Akimu Salat, and you've imposed an interpretation on those two words that's replaced what God is saying with what human beings have said and what human beings do with, what they think is God's blessing. So I don't mean to be polemical. I'm just trying to distinguish. That was just an example of how what I'm trying not to do and what most people, I think, do. Um, right. So trying to avoid putting myself, my own ideas between um, the Quran and the audience, sort of. And so that to me is an example of mixing truth with falsehood. We have the truth in the form of God's words, and then falsehood would be anything besides God's words, no matter how well intentioned. And then, and obviously, the negation is implied here as well, obviously. So the verse begins, Wallah, do not, and not. So then when it says, and conceal the truth, it of course means do not conceal the truth. So some translators will say, and do not mix truth with falsehood, or conceal the truth, because that's basically the meaning. So, or conceal the truth while you know. So it's not just don't add anything besides God's word to God's word, but also you have to not, you have to bear witness to God's word. Don't conceal the truth. And again, specifically as applied to the Jewish people, I think, and based on other verses that God has addressed to the Jewish people, I think what he's saying partly is, you have received the truth from me already. You know. Don't hide the truth just because you don't want to admit that what you have received from me in the form of the Torah gels with and is confirmed by and confirms the Quran. And that will come up later in the same surah, because evidently um, the Jews, kind of like the Christians um, in past eras, wouldn't necessarily be broadcasting what the Torah said. I think some of it was kind of kept private. And I mentioned the Christians because to this day, Catholics are not necessarily encouraged to read the entire Bible. And traditionally, it was the priest's job to read the Bible and then to present it to the people in parts. And to this day, if you go to a Catholic service, they read passages from the Bible. But it's less common amongst Catholics to just read it cover to cover the way that like Protestants will. So that idea of kind of keeping the book under wraps, and God is saying, don't conceal the truth. Let everyone hear what the truth is, and let them judge for themselves. And don't try to hide the fact that the Torah and the Quran are saying basically the same thing, right? And this applies to the Christians as well. Um, okay. But then again, applied more generally to all of us, I think it can mean, just as do not mix truth with falsehood means, just don't mix anything of yourself, your own ideas. Don't obscure the truth with your own bias. Here, you have received the truth. You have some knowledge of the truth. Don't hide it. You should be testifying to it. If you go out into the world and people are saying something that's not true, it's your job to say, however modestly, well, no, this is untrue. Here's what the real truth is. Um, so always, with the Quran, when there are injunctions, you think, okay, well, how would this apply to me? And where would it be difficult for me to apply this teaching? So that's partly how I arrived at this interpretation. Um, that's the other thing to do. I mean, if there's an interpretation where it is your own idea, at least admit that, well, this is my idea. I'm trying to understand, I'm trying to apply this to everyday circumstances. I don't know whether this is a circumstance that God had in mind um, when he issued this command, do not conceal the truth. It seems logical to me, that's all. But so the circumstance being where you are shy about or afraid about speaking the truth. God is saying, don't be shy about speaking the truth. Don't conceal it, right? Doesn't mean stand on a street corner with a sign. Um, doesn't mean not to do that, but it doesn't specify how you are to not conceal the truth, but that's an injunction upon you. Okay, so now we move on to verse 43, which begins, I've already said, with Hakimu al Swalat. And of course, this phrase appears earlier in Baqarah, and I'm pretty sure I've talked about it. And my own efforts to understand it, evolved, partly based on what I hear from other people. But in Baqarah, verse 3, which is where we have a description of basically the people for whom this Quran is a guidance. It's a guidance for the muttaqin, first of all, those who defend themselves, those who are seeking protection and salvation, and for those who believe in the unseen, or perhaps believe with the unseen, and yuqimun al-salat. So there's that same phrase, but in basically a different verb tense of kind of present tense continuous, I guess. Yuqimun al-salat. So they are standing in Swalat. And here we have it in the imperative tense in verse 43, Akimu Swalat. Yukimun, Akimu, it's the same root word. And again, that word means stand. So certainly we can take stand metaphorically, but that's not the same as transforming the word into a totally different word, which would be establish. So I don't believe that it means establish in the sense of just create a regular practice of praying in just this way, just this many times a day, etc. That, I mean, that's just not what it's literally saying. So what does it mean to stand? Partly it probably does mean literally physically stand, that when you recite the Quran, you should stand up. There are other verses that do say stand up to recite the Quran. But certainly metaphorically as well, I think stand in communication with God has the implication of stay, right? To stand means to stay in place. So try as best you can to stay continually in contact with God. And how would you do that? Well, what is communication? It's to exchange words, right? And I guess, we are ourselves to speak to God in the sense of praying to Him. We're given words, but not in our own words, but in the words that God has given us. He tells us which words to say. Cool, say this. Say, I seek protection from God. Say, I seek refuge, God. Say, God, forgive me. Say, God, guide me. Or say things like, from Fatiha, you alone do we serve, you alone do we ask for help, even though as a description of ourselves, it's not accurate. It's not true that we only serve God and only ask God for help, but that's sort of the model that we're setting up for ourselves. So God gives us the words with which to communicate with Him. And He also, thinking of the other direction of communication, He also sends words to us through the Quran. So to stand in communication with God would mean both to speak to God, address God in the words He's given us, and also to listen to the words that He's continually sending. So if you pray to God, asking God for guidance, we already know what those words are. We just, different words come to us at different times based on which passage we're reading the Quran, or just which passage comes to mind if we're standing and just addressing God in a more personal way. But those words come to us, they're ready-made kind of in the Quran. So I take this to mean, to be part of the meaning here, that you're continually addressing God in the words He has given you to address Him, and continually reflecting upon the words that God utters in the Quran. And that reflection is how we listen to God, right? It's not the same as a voice coming from the sky speaking directly, but it's pretty close to that. We already know that voice has already come down from the sky, and it's recorded in the Quran. And so to communicate with God is to reflect upon the words that voice has spoken. Now, a further metaphorical meaning, I think, of stand in Salat, stand in communication, could be stand upon your efforts at communicating. In other words, try to build a foundation upon those efforts at communication. Whatever you do in life, try to base it on what you have learned from this communication with God. Okay, so it says, "Aqimu al-salat wa atu al-zakat." And here, a similar kind of phrase that again has this very biased interpretation in the standard translations and commentaries. Literally, it means give, atu, give, al-zakat. And zakat, I haven't looked up this word recently, but I know that it relates to the word purity, purification. So it does not literally mean charity or um, anything like that. It means something to do with purity, purification. But again, the standard translation is give charity, right? And even to the point of saying, oh, it's give 2.5% of your income or something like that. So you see, again, this matching up of the words of the Quran with a long established practice amongst this Islamic culture. But it's that there's a big leap between the words and then that practice or interpretation. So, but admittedly, it's not like we have an easy literal interpretation because what does it mean to say give purification? And so we have to try as best we can to bridge those two words without really any prepositions. But the interpretation that I find most convincing, and it's not my own interpretation, it's someone else's, it's basically my father-in-law's, is to give in a way that purifies you, right? So that you're whatever you're giving, that act of giving purifies you. Okay, so it's not that far from the standard interpretation. It is about charity, although charity in the broadest sense of just any kind of giving. So it doesn't have to be material. Um, Whatever you have, because what we have is material as well as non-material, right? Things like intelligence, even whatever you have of knowledge of the Quran or guidance from God, time, energy, as well as, yes, material wealth. Give of that in such a way as to purify yourself and also perhaps to purify what you have, right? Maybe your intellect or your even your property will become purer, less corrupt, less tainted, if you are giving from it, right? Using it to try to serve God. Um, and the other thought I had just today was that it's also perhaps this purification is also a matter of focusing your energies and your efforts, because when we don't give of ourselves, we're basically serving ourselves. But of course, ourselves, as most people know, will agree, are very um, scattered, right? So we have all different desires, all different ambitions, and they change all the time. So when you're serving yourself, your energies and your efforts get scattered. Whereas if you try to serve God, and if you have, a fairly clear sense of what God's will is, as conveyed in this book, then that focuses your energies and your efforts and gives you this sense of purpose and of sort of direction. And that perhaps is partly what's meant by this purification. Because, of course, purity means both goodness and like in a specific sense of kind of cleanness, but it also means unadulterated, not mixed, right? Which kind of echoes what was just said in the previous ayah. Don't mix truth with falsehood. But so your efforts, your energies are not being scattered, they're not being mixed, they're being focused. That's a possible meaning here. But certainly the gist seems to be give of yourself. And of course, we know this is again echoing the description from verse 3 or verse 2 rather onward of Baqarah, where it says that this is a guidance for the muttaqin, those who believe in with the unseen and stand by Salat or in Salat, and from what we have provided them, they spend. So I take giving zakat to be related to, if not identical with, yunfikun, spending from what you have been provided with. Um, and again, what you've been provided with, right, can be anything from your own bodies, your own minds, your health, your wealth, your education, right, your intelligence, um, even things like, well, if you find that, I feel like I'm a fairly decent person. Even your own decency is something that's been given to you. So use those. Don't just be like complacent. Don't be pleased with yourself. Okay, I'm a decent person. I'm educated. I'm smart. Whatever it is, good for me. Rather, use that then. What are you going to do with all of these things that God has given you? When you think of it as something given, it makes it easier to then expect of yourself, or rather listen to God's expression of expectation of you. But to expect of yourself and to realize that God expects of you that you do something about it, right? Not just keep on keeping on. Um, so I think this is a very important thing, and it's very easy. Like personally, I don't think this is something I've thought about because while I would say that I've tried for many years to seek some kind of truth, it was entirely, for my own sake. And God doesn't say that's wrong. God does say that, you're seeking guidance for your own sake, for your nafs, for yourself. But he is also saying, okay, now here's part of the guidance is you have to think beyond your own self, right? Certainly in the sense of traditional charity, and the Quran gets to that of giving to the poor, giving to those who ask, etc. Um, but also in the sense of, okay, well, how can I help other people to arrive at this guidance that God has given me? Um, Now, of course, God repeatedly tells us, well, you actually can't do hardly anything to guide other people because they have to receive guidance from God. They have to seek guidance, etc. But what you can do is relate this message. Um, so that I think that work of trying to, in whatever way God gives you, to try to relate the message of the Quran is in fact part of what is meant by giving zakat, right? And that would certainly be part of your own purification. Um, because I think when reading the Quran, studying the Quran remains an act of personal study, and that's crucially important. And perhaps, who knows, I mean, for each person it's going to be different. Personally, I studied the Quran, or at least read the Quran, for about 10, well, for a number of years before I began to try to talk to other people about what the Quran says, right? And about 10 years before I started doing lectures like this. Um, but I think it's a crucial stage that in purifying your efforts at understanding the Quran, a crucial stage is to start trying to communicate the Quran to other people. Um, okay, and then the last requirement given here in this kind of list of requirements, which again is addressed specifically to the Jews but really applies to everyone, is and bow down with those who bow down. I can't think of any other translation for that word. The word is the same word as like rakat, right? So in traditional Islamic prayer, a rakat is like one, I think, is one session of, or one iteration of bowing the head, as opposed to sajdu, or asjudu, where you get on your knees and kind of your hands and even your forehead touches the ground. Um, and again, I don't really hold with traditional ideas about prayer, but it does seem that God is talking about the physical act of bowing down. But since we've already interpreted standing in salat and giving of zakat is metaphorical as well as physical, right? It's not just about giving, handing out money. It's not just about standing up. It is partly those things, but not just about those things. Likewise, I think it makes sense to take bowing down here, not to be exclusively lowering the head and the upper part of the body, but also what does that imply? Obviously, respect, reverence, and the emphasis perhaps here is with those who bow down. So be part of a community, not necessarily not a church, not a sect, but don't create schisms, don't create churches and sects. If other people are respecting God, revering God, showing respect to God, you should be with them too. Um, so I think partly this is part of the larger message of don't separate yourself from other people. Don't stand upon some private um, ideas about God and religion, but be one community of believers in God. And that message gets continued in subsequent verses. And that's where I think partly the specificity of this passage comes in too, that because the Jews are being told, look, I know this is a new revelation. You have your prior revelations, and that was kind of this insular community that you built because the prophets from Moses onward were basically Jewish. Um, and now the prophet is not Jewish, and there's some differences here, and we're going to change the Qibla, the direction of prayer, etc., etc. But it's basically the same message. And this is a test for you, the Jewish people, to be less insular, and also to solve the rifts within your own community because there's these sects within the Jewish community. And now just if someone's bowing to God, you bow with them, right? Um, so I'll leave it at that. And next time we'll move on to verses 44 and onward.